The recording device was smaller than a quarter, nestled behind the sugar bowl like a metallic spider waiting to feast on secrets. Sarah Chen discovered it on a Tuesday morning while reaching for her usual 2 teaspoons of brown sugar, the same ritual she'd performed every morning for 8 years of marriage. The tiny red light blinked once, twice, then went dark as her trembling fingers brushed against its cold surface. Her coffee mug slipped from her other hand, shattering against the marble countertop David had insisted they install during last year's kitchen renovation. The sound echoed through their pristine suburban home like a gunshot, sharp and final. Dark liquid spread across the white stone in irregular patterns, resembling the very chaos that had been quietly consuming their marriage for months. "Sarah! Everything all right in there?" David's voice drifted from the living room where the morning news anchors discussed rising divorce rates with clinical detachment. His tone carried that practiced concern she'd once found endearing, but now recognized as performance art. "Just clumsy," she called back, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. The recording device sat innocent and patient in her palm, no bigger than a breath mint, but heavy as a tombstone. How long had it been there? How many conversations had it swallowed? How many private moments between friends, between mother and daughter, between woman and mirror had been digitized and filed away like evidence in a case she didn't know was being built against her? The kitchen felt different now, contaminated. Every surface seemed to harbor potential surveillance. The decorative bowl they'd bought on their honeymoon in Tuscany, could it hide a camera? The family photos magneted to the refrigerator, were they positioned to obscure recording equipment? The very air felt thick with betrayal, as if trust could be measured in atmospheric pressure, and theirs had just plummeted to dangerous levels. Sarah's phone buzzed against the granite counter. A text from her sister Maya. "Coffee later? Need to vent about mom's latest drama." The irony wasn't lost on her. How many times had Maya sat in this very kitchen, pouring her heart out about her mother's manipulative tactics, her father's drinking, her brother's gambling debts? How many times had Sarah offered advice, comfort, and sanctuary within these walls that were apparently wired for sound? She typed back with fingers that felt disconnected from her body. "Rain check. Having a weird morning." David appeared in the doorway, 6 feet of practiced charm in a pressed shirt and tie. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his smile warm and concerned. The same expression he'd worn when he'd held her hand in the hospital during her miscarriage 2 years ago, when he'd promised they'd get through it together. Now she wondered if even that moment had been calculated, if his comfort had come with conditions and clauses she'd been too grief-stricken to read. "You sure you're okay?" He stepped carefully around the broken ceramic, his expensive leather shoes making soft sounds against the hardwood. "You seem, I don't know, distracted lately." The recording device felt radioactive in her closed fist. Part of her wanted to throw it at him, to watch his mask slip and see what lived underneath. Instead, she forced a smile and opened her hand, revealing the electronic betrayal like a terrible magic trick. "Found your little friend behind the sugar bowl." For a fraction of a second, maybe less than a heartbeat, David's composure cracked. His eyes widened slightly, his mouth open as if to form words that wouldn't come, and something desperate and cornered flickered across his features. Then, like clouds shifting across the sun, his expression reorganized itself into something that might have passed for confusion if she hadn't seen that momentary lapse. "What is that?" He stepped closer, reaching for the device with an extended palm. "Some kind of battery?" Sarah closed her fist again, taking a step backward. The granite counter pressed against her lower back, cold and unforgiving. "It's a recording device, David. Voice-activated. Professional grade from the looks of it." "A recording device? In our kitchen? That's crazy. Maybe it's from the security installation. Remember when those guys were here last month?" But Sarah remembered the security installation very clearly. She'd taken the day off work to supervise, had watched every wire run, and every component placed. The system was outdoor cameras only. David had insisted they didn't need indoor monitoring because their home was their sanctuary, their private retreat from the world. The irony was so sharp it could cut glass. The security company didn't install anything inside the house. You made sure of that. Said you didn't want Big Brother watching us eat breakfast. David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. It was a tell she'd learned to recognize during their courtship when he played poker with his law firm colleagues. He was calculating, measuring, deciding how much truth the situation could bear. "Look, I'm as confused as you are," he said, extending his hand again. "Why don't you give it to me and I'll figure out where it came from? Could be corporate espionage. You know how competitive things are getting at the firm. Maybe someone's trying to get inside information about our cases." The explanation was smooth, plausible, delivered with the same confident tone he used in depositions. But she'd learned to listen not just to words, but to the spaces between them, the micropauses where truth hid from light. There was something rehearsed about his response, as if he'd prepared for this moment, gamed out the scenarios, and armed himself with reasonable doubt. "Corporate espionage," she repeated slowly, tasting the words like wine gone sour. "In our kitchen. Listening to conversations about grocery lists and weekend plans? You'd be surprised what people reveal in casual conversation," David said, his tone shifting towards professorial. "Financial troubles, personal conflicts, strategic information? Industrial espionage is more common than people think." It was possible. Sarah's accounting firm had landed several high-profile contracts recently, and David's law practice specialized in corporate mergers that involved millions in asset transfers. But the device had been positioned with surgical precision behind the sugar bowl, in the exact spot where she stood every morning during her most vulnerable moments, still in pajamas, hair unbrushed, guards completely down as she prepared for another day of maintaining the perfect life they had constructed together. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was her friend Lisa. "Thanks for listening yesterday. Really needed someone who understands marriage isn't always Pinterest perfect." Sarah's stomach dropped. Yesterday's conversation had covered Lisa's suspicions about her husband's affair, her fears about custody battles, her desperate need for emotional support from someone she trusted completely. If that conversation had been recorded, if David had access to Lisa's private confessions, "I'm keeping this," she said, slipping it into her pocket. "I'm going to have it analyzed." David's mask slipped again, just for an instant. This time she caught a glimpse of something cold and predatory, like a snake deciding whether its prey was worth the energy expenditure. "Sarah, be reasonable. If someone's targeting us, we need to handle this properly. I know people who specialize in electronic surveillance, former FBI guys who know how to trace these things back to their source." His voice carried that gentle condescension she'd grown to hate, the tone that suggested her concerns were adorable but ultimately irrelevant. "I'm sure you do," she said, walking past him toward the hallway. She paused at the kitchen threshold, looking back at the man she had promised to love in sickness and health, for richer and poorer, until death do them part. The morning light streaming through their picture window illuminated his face in harsh relief, throwing shadows that made him look like a stranger.
To get dressed, then to work, then to figure out what kind of marriage I'm actually living in. The silence that followed felt like a held breath, like the moment before a verdict is read or a storm breaks. David stood perfectly still among the broken pieces of her coffee mug, his expensive suit incongruous against the domestic chaos, his handsome face a masterpiece of controlled neutrality. "We should talk about this tonight," he said finally, "when we've both had time to process, when emotions aren't running so high." Sarah almost laughed, emotions running high, as if discovering surveillance equipment in your own kitchen was simply a case of feminine hysteria, a temporary imbalance that would resolve itself with proper management, as if 8 years of marriage could be reduced to an emotional weather system that just needed time to clear. "Yes," she agreed, "we should definitely talk tonight." But as she climbed the stairs to their bedroom, the recording device warm in her pocket like a mechanical heart, Sarah Chen knew that talking was probably the last thing she should do. Every word she'd spoken since discovering the device had potentially been captured, analyzed, filed away for future use. Her own home had become a courtroom where she was simultaneously plaintiff, defendant, and unwitting witness to her own prosecution. The bedroom felt different, too, infected by the possibility of hidden eyes and ears. She dressed quickly in professional armor, navy suit, low heels, hair pulled back in a neat bun that suggested competence and control. In the mirror, she looked like the successful woman she'd worked so hard to become. Partner track at a respected accounting firm, homeowner in an upscale neighborhood, wife to a rising attorney who brought her flowers on random Tuesdays and remembered her mother's birthday. But mirrors, she was learning, could lie as expertly as husbands. Her phone rang as she was applying lipstick. The caller ID showed her mother's number, and Sarah's finger hovered over the decline button. How many conversations with her mother had been recorded? How many times had she vented about David's long hours, his increasing criticism, his way of making her feel small in their big, beautiful house? Her mother, despite her flaws, was fiercely protective of her daughters. If she knew what David had done. "Hi, Mom." "Sweetheart, I had the strangest dream about you last night. You were trapped in a house made of glass, and no matter how loud you screamed, no one could hear you." Her mother's voice carried the mystical certainty she brought to all her premonitions, real or imagined. "Is everything all right?" Sarah looked around their bedroom, their king-size bed with its Egyptian cotton sheets, the walk-in closet organized with military precision, the ensuite bathroom with its marble surfaces and heated floors. It was a beautiful cage, she realized. A glass house where she'd been screaming silently for months while David documented every sound for reasons she was only beginning to understand. "Everything's fine, Mom, just work stress." The skepticism in her mother's voice could have powered a small city. "Well, you know where I am if you need me. Your father is at his sister's for the week, so I've got plenty of time to listen." After hanging up, Sarah sat on the edge of their bedroom and forced herself to think like an accountant, to approach this crisis with the same analytical precision she brought to balance sheets and tax returns. What were the facts? David had planted at least one recording device in their home. He'd lied about it when confronted. He'd tried to manipulate her into handing over the evidence. The question wasn't whether he was betraying her. That much was clear. The question was why? Divorce, obviously, but David made more money than she did, and they had no children to fight over. Their assets were largely joint, their debts minimal. What could he possibly gain from covert surveillance that he couldn't achieve through normal legal channels? Unless he wasn't planning a normal divorce. Unless he was planning something that required her to look unstable, unreliable, unfit for whatever came next. The recording device seemed to pulse in her pocket like a mechanical tumor. How many more were there? How long had this been going on? And most terrifying of all, what had she said in the privacy of her own home that could be twisted into evidence against her? Her hands were shaking as she gathered her purse and car keys. She needed coffee, she needed air, she needed someone she could trust with the terrible knowledge growing in her chest like a cancer. But trust, she was learning, was a luxury she could no longer afford. The house felt like a museum of her own life as she walked through it. Every room an exhibit of the woman she'd been before this morning, before the discovery that had split her existence into before and after with surgical precision. The living room where she'd hosted book club meetings, the dining room where they had entertained David's colleagues, the front hallway where wedding photos smiled down from perfect walls. All of it contaminated now. All of it evidence in a case she didn't understand. As Sarah opened the front door, she caught sight of their neighbor Mrs. Patterson walking her ancient golden retriever. The older woman waved with genuine warmth, the kind of neighborly affection that belonged to a simpler time when homes were sanctuaries and marriages were partnerships instead of surveillance operations. "Beautiful morning," Mrs. Patterson called out.
How's that husband of yours? Still working those terrible hours? He's dedicated, Sarah managed, the words feeling like broken glass in her throat. The recording device pressed against her leg as she walked to her car, a constant reminder that nothing in her life was what it seemed. The morning sun felt too bright, the suburban street too quiet, the normalcy of other people's lives too distant to touch. But as she drove away from the house that no longer felt like home, Sarah Chen made a decision. If David wanted to play games with recording devices and covert operations, she would learn the rules. If he wanted to build a case against her, she would build a better one against him. The war had begun with a small red light behind a sugar bowl, but Sarah intended to win it.
Evolution of a marriage settling into comfortable routine. Now she wondered if it had been reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, disguised as spousal interest. Her assistant knocked and entered without waiting for permission. A privilege Sarah had granted years ago when professional boundaries had felt less important than efficiency. "Your sister Maya called," Jenny said, setting a fresh cup of coffee on Sarah's desk with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to read moods from posture and breathing patterns. "She wants to know if you're having some kind of breakdown because you canceled coffee, and you never cancel coffee." Sarah almost smiled. Maya knew her too well, understood that consistency was her anchor in a world that often felt chaotic. Coffee dates, morning routines, weekend grocery shopping. These rituals weren't just habits, but lifelines, ways of maintaining control when everything else felt uncertain. "Tell her I'm fine, just busy." Jenny didn't move. At 28, she possessed the kind of emotional intelligence that made her invaluable as an assistant and occasionally exhausting as a human being. She could detect dishonesty from 3 rooms away and had no qualms about calling it out. "You've been staring at the Hendricks report for 2 hours without turning a page, and you forgot to take off your sunglasses when you came in this morning, in October, on a cloudy day." Sarah reached up and discovered that Jenny was right. The sunglasses were still perched on her nose, a barrier between herself and the world that she'd apparently forgotten she had erected. "Personal stuff," she said, removing the glasses and immediately feeling too exposed. "Nothing that affects work." "Everything affects work eventually," Jenny said with the wisdom of someone who'd seen 3 different partners navigate messy divorces. "Maya seemed genuinely worried. Said you sounded weird on the phone." The phone. How many conversations had David recorded through their landline, their cell phones? The paranoia were starting to feel like a living thing in Sarah's chest, growing and shifting and consuming rational thought. Every device was potentially compromised, every conversation a risk, every moment of privacy an illusion. Her computer chimed with an incoming email. The sender was David, the subject line blank, the timestamp showing he'd sent it just 5 minutes ago. Her hands trembled slightly as she clicked it open. "Thinking about you. Hope your day is going better than your morning. Let's have dinner at Romano's tonight, your favorite place. We need to talk, but somewhere neutral, somewhere comfortable. I love you, D." The message was perfect, loving but not effusive, concerned but not desperate, suggesting transparency while carefully controlling the environment. Romano's was indeed her favorite restaurant, a small Italian place where they'd had their first official date 8 years ago. The food was excellent, the atmosphere intimate, the staff friendly but not intrusive. It was also public enough that she couldn't cause a scene, emotional enough that any confrontation would feel like sacrilege against their shared history. David was a lawyer, she reminded herself. He knew how to manipulate environments, how to use setting and emotion and memory as weapons. Even his choice of restaurant was strategic, designed to put her at a disadvantage before the conversation even began. She typed back, "Romano's at 7. We definitely need to talk." But as she sent the response, Sarah was already planning her own strategy. If David wanted to control the conversation by controlling the location, she would control it by controlling the information. She had 8 hours to figure out exactly what she was dealing with, 8 hours to prepare for a confrontation that would determine the shape of her future. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, which immediately triggered another wave of paranoia. Was David monitoring her calls? Did he know who she spoke to and when? The thoughts were becoming recursive, spiraling inward like water down a drain. Sarah Chen? Miss Chen, this is Detective Maria Rodriguez with the Metro Police. I'm hoping you can help me with something. Sarah's blood turned to ice water. What kind of something?
We're investigating a case involving electronic surveillance equipment. I understand you work with financial investigations, so you might have experience with this kind of thing. Could we meet sometime today? It's urgent. The coincidence was too perfect, too convenient. David was a criminal defense attorney with connections throughout the legal system. Was this part of his strategy? A way to control the narrative before she could develop her own? What kind of case? Sarah asked carefully. Corporate espionage. Someone's been planting recording devices in private homes to gather intelligence on business dealings. We've had 3 reports this week, all from people in finance or legal professions, all from your general neighborhood. Relief and terror warred in Sarah's chest. Either this was legitimate, which meant she wasn't alone, wasn't crazy, wasn't the only victim of this particular violation, or it was an elaborate setup designed to make her believe she was part of a larger pattern while actually being the sole target of a very personal attack. I might have some information relevant to your case, Sarah said slowly. I was hoping you'd say that. Can you come to the station this afternoon? Say around 2 o'clock? I'll be there. After hanging up, Sarah sat in her office chair and forced herself to breathe normally. The morning had begun with the discovery of one recording device and had now expanded to include police investigations and patterns of surveillance that stretched beyond her marriage. She felt like Alice tumbling down the rabbit hole, except in this version, the Mad Hatter was wearing a wedding ring and filing legal briefs. Jenny appeared in the doorway again, her expression shifting from concern to alarm as she took in Sarah's appearance. Okay, that's it, she said, stepping into the office and closing the door behind her. I'm staging an intervention. Talk to me. Sarah looked at her assistant, 28 years old, unmarried, student loan debt that would follow her into middle age, dreams of law school that she pursued through night classes while working 50-hour weeks. Jenny's life was complicated, but honest, transparent in ways that Sarah's had apparently never been. If you discovered that someone you trusted had been lying to you, someone whose lies could potentially destroy your life, what would you do? Jenny's eyes narrowed. Are we talking about David? Hypothetically. Hypothetically, I'd burn his world down and salt the earth so nothing could ever grow there again. Jenny's voice was matter-of-fact, as if she'd given this scenario considerable previous thought. But practically, I'd gather evidence first, document everything, build an airtight case before making any moves. And if the person was a lawyer who specialized in making people disappear through legal maneuvering, then I'd make sure I had more than one exit strategy. Jenny settled into the chair across from Sarah's desk. And I'd make sure I wasn't fighting this battle alone. The phone rang again. This time it was Maya, and I could hear the worry in her voice before she even spoke. Okay, what's wrong? And don't tell me nothing because you're the most predictably stable person I know, and you've been acting weird for weeks. Weeks. Had Maya noticed changes that Sarah herself had missed? The slow erosion of trust? The gradual shift from partnership to surveillance? The careful construction of a case against her that she'd been too close to see? Can you meet me for lunch? Sarah asked. Somewhere quiet? I can meet you anywhere. When and where? The coffee shop on 5th Street, the one with the outdoor seating. In an hour. I'll be there. Sarah? Yeah? Whatever this is, we'll figure it out. That's what sisters do. After Maya hung up, Sarah sat in the silence of her office and tried to organize her thoughts, like she would organize a complex audit. What were the facts? David had installed surveillance equipment in their home. He'd lied about it when confronted. He'd attempted to control her response to the discovery. A police detective had called about a pattern of similar incidents. David wanted to meet at Romano's, a public place where emotional responses would be constrained by social convention. What were her resources?
financial independence through her career, a sister who could provide emotional support and potentially safe harbor, professional connections in the legal and financial communities, the recording device itself, which might contain evidence of wrongdoing beyond mere surveillance. What were her risks? David's access to her personal information, possibly including her financial accounts, her communications, her professional dealings, his connections in the legal system that could be used to discredit her or marginalize her, the possibility that the police contact was part of his strategy rather than genuine law enforcement. What were her goals? Understanding the scope of David's deception, protecting herself legally and financially, preserving her professional reputation, finding a path forward that didn't leave her destroyed in the wreckage of her marriage. Sarah opened her laptop and began typing a detailed account of the morning's events, including timestamps, exact quotes, and her emotional responses to each revelation. If David was building a case against her, she would build a better one against him. If he wanted to play games with recording devices and surveillance, she would document everything with the meticulous precision that had made her reputation in corporate investigations. But as she worked, a darker thought began to emerge. What if the surveillance wasn't about divorce proceedings? What if David had discovered something about her that she didn't even know herself? Corporate accounting involved access to sensitive financial information, insider knowledge about mergers and acquisitions, data that could be valuable to the right bidders. What if David wasn't just recording her personal conversations, but her professional ones? What if he was using their marriage as cover for corporate espionage on a scale that made her personal betrayal seem almost quaint? The recording device in her desk drawer suddenly felt like a loaded gun, not just evidence of personal betrayal, but potentially proof of criminal activity that stretched far beyond their suburban kitchen and their failing marriage. Sarah saved her document to an encrypted drive and backed it up to 3 different cloud services. Then she gathered her purse, locked her office, and prepared to meet her sister for a conversation that would either save her life or destroy it completely. The war that had begun with a small red light behind a sugar bowl was expanding into something much larger and more dangerous than she'd imagined. But Sarah Chen had built her career on following financial trails wherever they led, no matter how complex or uncomfortable the destination. This investigation would be no different. The coffee shop on 5th Street buzzed with the controlled chaos of the lunch rush, but Maya had secured a corner table on the outdoor patio where their conversation would be masked by traffic noise and the gentle clatter of dishes. Sarah's sister possessed an instinct for privacy that came from years of working as a social worker, where confidentiality wasn't just professional courtesy, but often a matter of life and death. Maya was already nursing her second latte when Sarah arrived, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her clothes chosen for comfort rather than impression. At 34, she was 2 years older than Sarah, but had always seemed younger, more optimistic, still capable of genuine surprise at human cruelty, even after a decade of child protective services. "You look like you haven't slept in weeks," Maya said without preamble, "and you're wearing sunglasses again, in October, on a cloudy day." Sarah removed the glasses and set them on the table between them like a peace offering. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to promise that you won't overreact. I'm a social worker. Overreacting is professionally discouraged." Maya's attempt at humor couldn't quite hide the concern in her eyes. "What's going on?" Sarah reached into her purse and withdrew the recording device. Still wrapped in tissue paper, she placed it on the table where it looked innocent and harmless, like a forgotten piece of jewelry or a discarded electronics component. "I found this in our kitchen this morning, behind the sugar bowl." Maya leaned forward, her expression shifting from concern to confusion to something darker and more dangerous. "What is it?" "Professional surveillance equipment. Voice-activated, weeks of battery life, encrypted storage." David planted it. The silence that followed felt like a held breath. Maya picked up the device with the careful precision of someone accustomed to handling evidence, turning it over in her hands like a forensic investigator. "You're sure it was David?" He lied when I confronted him, tried to convince me it was corporate espionage, then tried to get me to hand it over so his FBI contacts could trace it. Sarah's voice sounded hollow even to herself. "I've been thinking about it all morning. The timing, the placement, the way he's been acting lately, it's been going on for months. Maya set the device down gently, as if it might explode. Her face had taken on the controlled neutrality she wore when investigating child abuse cases, when emotions had to be carefully managed to preserve professional objectivity. What kind of acting? Questions about my schedule, my conversations, my work, interest in my phone calls, my emails, where I went and who I talked to. I thought it was affection, increased intimacy as our marriage matured. I laughed bitterly. It was reconnaissance. Have you contacted the police? Someone claiming to be a detective called me this morning, said they're investigating a pattern of surveillance in our neighborhood targeting people in finance and legal professions. I'm supposed to meet with them at 2 o'clock. Maya's eyes sharpened. Claiming to be? David's a criminal defense attorney. He has connections throughout the legal system. The timing feels too convenient. A young mother at the next table was trying to negotiate with her toddler over vegetable consumption, her voice patient but strained. Normal family drama, the kind of everyday conflict that belonged to a world where husbands didn't spy on wives and marriages weren't covert operations. Sarah felt a sharp pang of envy for problems that simple. Tell me about the changes in his behavior. When did they start? Sarah forced herself to think like an investigator rather than a victim, to approach her own life with the analytical distance she brought to corporate audits. 6 months ago? Maybe longer. It was subtle at first, just more interest in my daily routine. Then he started asking about my conversations with you, with mom, with friends. He said he felt left out of my social life. What did you tell him? Everything. The admission felt like swallowing broken glass. I told him everything because I thought that's what marriage was supposed to be. Complete transparency, no secrets, no private spaces where doubt could take root. Maya reached across the table and took Sarah's hands in her own. Her fingers were warm and calloused from weekend gardening, real and solid in ways that Sarah's life had apparently never been. Listen to me very carefully, Maya said. This is not your fault. Whatever David is planning, whatever he's been recording, this is not about anything you did wrong. But Sarah wasn't convinced. In the space between discovery and understanding, she'd been replaying months of conversations, searching for moments that could be taken out of context, twisted into evidence of instability or unfitness. The fight they'd had about starting a family again after the miscarriage, her frustration with his long hours and emotional distance, her complaints about his mother's interference in their marriage. All of it potentially documented, filed away, prepared for use against her. There's something else, Sarah said. I think this might be bigger than just our marriage. She told Maya about her suspicions regarding corporate espionage, about her access to sensitive financial information, and David's questions about her professional dealings. Maya listened with the focused attention of someone trained to recognize patterns of manipulation and abuse. He's been asking about your clients? Not directly, but he's shown increased interest in my work schedule, my travel, which cases I'm working on. Last month, he suggested I apply for a position at Hartwell and Associates, the firm that handles mergers for Meridian Corp. Exactly. I thought it was career advice. Now I'm wondering if it was strategic placement. Maya sat back in her chair, her expression grim. If you're right, if this is about corporate espionage, then you're not just dealing with a cheating husband or a messy divorce. You're potentially dealing with federal crimes. The recording device sat between them like a small monument to betrayal, proof that the life Sarah had built was constructed on foundations that had never been solid. Around them, the coffee shop continued its normal rhythm, conversations about weekend plans and work frustrations, and the everyday intimacies that Sarah had thought she shared with David. I need to know how extensive this is, how many devices, how long it's been going on, what he's recorded. I need to understand what I'm dealing with before I make any moves. You need professional help. A private investigator, a lawyer who specializes in electronic surveillance, maybe the FBI if your corporate espionage theory is correct. I can't trust anyone in David's professional network. He knows everyone in the legal community. Maya pulled out her phone and began scrolling through contacts. I know someone. Elena Vasquez, former federal prosecutor, now in private practice, specializing in white-collar crime and surveillance cases. She helped me with a case last year involving electronic monitoring of foster families. She's completely outside David's circles. Can you trust her? With your life. That phrase sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with the October afternoon. With your life. Was that what this was really about? Not just divorce proceedings or corporate espionage, but something that posed actual physical danger? Her phone buzzed with a text from David. Looking forward to dinner tonight. Romano's at 7. I have something important to discuss with you. Something important. She showed the message to Maya, whose expression darkened further. You're not going. I have to go. If I don't show up, he'll know that I know. I need more time to understand what I'm dealing with before he realizes I'm building a case against him. It could be dangerous. If he's capable of months of surveillance, if he's involved in corporate espionage, then you don't know what else he's capable of. But Sarah had already made her decision. The war that had begun with a small red light behind a sugar bowl required intelligence gathering before any direct confrontation. She needed to know what David thought she knew, what he was planning to do about it, and how much time she had before his strategy moved to the next phase.
I'm going to keep the dinner date, she said, but I'm going to record it. Maya's eyes widened. That's incredibly dangerous. So is living blind to whatever he's planning. Sarah wrapped the recording device in its tissue paper and returned it to her purse. He's been documenting my conversations for months. Turnabout is fair play. Sarah, listen to me. Whatever you're planning, you need backup. You need people who know where you are and what you're doing. You need an exit strategy. Will you call Elena Vasquez? Set up a meeting for tomorrow morning. Of course, but I'm also calling Mom and I'm having her come stay with me tonight. I want you to have somewhere safe to go if things go bad. Their mother. Sarah's stomach clenched at the thought of involving their parents in this mess. Margaret Chen had survived immigration, poverty, and decades of marriage to a man who expressed love through criticism and control. She'd raised 2 daughters to be independent and strong, but she'd also lived through enough hardship to recognize real danger when she saw it. Don't tell her the details yet, Sarah said. Just that I might need a place to stay for a few days. She'll ask questions. Tell her I'll explain everything tomorrow. Maya nodded, but her expression remained troubled. What about the police meeting this afternoon? Sarah checked her watch. It was already 1:30, and the police station was 15 minutes away. I'm going. If it's legitimate, I need to know what they found. If it's part of David's strategy, I need to understand how he's planning to use law enforcement against me. Promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you'll call if anything feels wrong. I promise. But as Sarah left the coffee shop and walked to her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that careful was no longer an option. The world had shifted beneath her feet, revealing chasms where she'd thought there was solid ground. Every choice now carried the potential for catastrophic consequences. Every decision a step into territory where the rules she'd lived by no longer applied. The police station occupied a brutalist concrete building that spoke to an era when civic architecture was designed to intimidate rather than inspire. Sarah announced herself at the front desk and was directed to a small conference room where Detective Rodriguez was waiting with a thick folder and a recording device that looked remarkably similar to the one currently residing in Sarah's purse. Detective Rodriguez was younger than Sarah had expected, maybe early 30s, with the kind of focused intensity that suggested she'd seen enough human deception to approach every conversation as a potential interrogation. She stood as Sarah entered, extending a firm handshake and gesturing toward a chair across from her at the small table. Thank you for coming in, Miss Chen. I know this is probably disrupting your day, but we're dealing with a situation that's escalating quickly. Sarah settled into the chair and tried to project calm professionalism while her heart hammered against her ribs. You mentioned corporate espionage. 3 cases so far, all reported within the last week, all involving surveillance equipment planted in private homes belonging to people who work in finance or legal professions, all in your general neighborhood.
Detective Rodriguez opened the folder and withdrew several photographs of recording devices identical to the ones Sarah had discovered. Have you seen anything like this?
The moment of truth. Sarah reached into her purse and withdrew the tissue-wrapped device, placing it on the table between them. I found this in my kitchen this morning. Detective Rodriguez's expression sharpened. Where, specifically? Behind the sugar bowl on the counter. It was positioned to record conversations in the kitchen and adjacent living areas. Any idea how long it might have been there? Based on when my husband's behavior started changing, possibly 6 months, maybe longer. Your husband, Rodriguez made a note in her file. David Chen, attorney with Morrison Beck and Associates? Sarah's blood chilled. The detective knew David's name, his firm, probably his professional history. Either the investigation was more extensive than Rodriguez had initially indicated, or David's connections in law enforcement were being used to monitor Sarah's cooperation with police. How do you know about my husband? Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. We've been investigating these surveillance cases for 2 weeks, Ms. Chen. Your husband's name has come up in connection with several of our inquiries. Rodriguez leaned forward slightly. We have reason to believe he's not just a victim of this surveillance, but potentially involved in orchestrating it. The conference room suddenly felt too small, too airless. Sarah's hands began to tremble, and she clasped them together in her lap to hide the visible evidence of her distress. What kind of reason? Financial records showing purchases of surveillance equipment over the past 8 months. Credit card receipts from electronics stores that specialize in spy gear. Phone records indicating contact with individuals who have previous convictions for electronic surveillance and corporate espionage. Rodriguez was building a case, laying out evidence with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this many times before. But something felt wrong about the presentation. Too smooth, too convenient. Why would David leave such an obvious paper trail? Why would a criminal defense attorney with access to expert advice make such elementary mistakes? Are you recording this conversation? Sarah asked. With your permission, yes. Standard procedure for witness interviews. I'd prefer if you didn't. May I ask why? Because I'm beginning to think that nothing in my life is private anymore, and I need to maintain control over at least some of my own words. Rodriguez studied Sarah's face for a long moment, then reached over and switched off the recording device. Fair enough, but I need you to understand the seriousness of what we're dealing with. If your husband is involved in a corporate espionage ring, you could be in significant danger. What kind of danger? People who steal corporate secrets don't usually limit themselves to passive surveillance. When they feel threatened, when they think their operations are at risk of exposure, they can become violent. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire Sarah couldn't see, but could definitely smell. Violence. It was a word that belonged to other people's marriages, other people's problems, not to suburban professionals with joint checking account and coordinated retirement plans.
But as Sarah thought about David's behavior over the past months, she realized that she'd been seeing only the surface of something much deeper and more dangerous. The increased interest in her schedule, the questions about her work, the casual suggestions about career moves that would give him access to different types of financial information. I need to ask you something, Sarah said, and I need you to give me an honest answer. Rodriguez nodded. What is it? Is my husband a suspect, or is he working with you? The detective's micropause was all the answer Sarah needed. A heartbeat of hesitation, a fractional shift in expression that spoke to calculations being made behind professional neutrality. What makes you ask that? Because this feels too convenient. The timing of your call, your knowledge of David's professional details, the way you're presenting evidence that makes him look guilty while simultaneously warning me that I'm in danger, it feels like theater. Rodriguez sat back in her chair, and for the first time since Sarah had entered the room, she looked genuinely surprised. "You think your husband sent me?" "I think my husband is a criminal defense attorney with extensive connections in law enforcement. I think he's smart enough to know that planting surveillance equipment would eventually be discovered. And I think he's calculating enough to prepare for that discovery by controlling the narrative. Miss Chen, I can assure you that this investigation is completely legitimate. Your husband is not working with law enforcement in any capacity. In fact, based on the evidence we've gathered, he's likely to be arrested within the next 48 hours. The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Arrested. Within 48 hours? Whatever game David was playing, whatever strategy he'd been implementing for the past 6 months, it was reaching its endgame faster than she'd anticipated. On what charges? Electronic surveillance without consent? Conspiracy to commit corporate espionage? Possibly racketeering if we can prove he's part of a larger organization. Rodriguez leaned forward again. "Which is why I need you to help us." "Help you how?" "By wearing a wire to dinner tonight." The request landed in the small conference room like a grenade, with the pin already pulled. Sarah stared at Detective Rodriguez, trying to process what she'd just heard while her mind reeled with the implications. "You want me to record my husband? We want you to give him an opportunity to incriminate himself. Based on our investigation, he's been selling corporate secrets obtained through surveillance of finance professionals. Your dinner conversation tonight could provide the evidence we need to prosecute not just him, but the entire network he's working with." Sarah thought about the recording device in David's hands, about months of documented conversations that could be twisted into evidence against her. The idea of turning the tables, of making him the subject of surveillance instead of the perpetrator, carried a certain poetic justice. But it also carried enormous risk. What if he discovers the wire? What if he's prepared for this possibility? He won't discover it. The technology is completely undetectable, and you'll have backup nearby at all times. If anything goes wrong, we can have officers on scene within 30 seconds.
And if something goes wrong in those 30 seconds? Rodriguez's expression softened slightly. "I won't lie to you, Miss Chen. There are risks involved. But there are also risks in doing nothing. If David suspects that you're building a case against him, if he thinks you're going to expose his operations, he might decide that you pose an unacceptable threat." The unspoken implication hung between them like a sword suspended by a thread. Violence. The possibility that David wasn't just betraying her trust, but actively planning to eliminate her as a threat to his criminal enterprise. Sarah's phone buzzed with another text. "Can't wait to see you tonight. We have so much to discuss." The message felt different now, loaded with meaning she was only beginning to understand. We have so much to discuss. Was it a threat? A warning? An invitation to negotiate her own destruction? "I need time to think about this," Sarah said. "I understand, but I need an answer within the next 2 hours. If you're going to wear the wire, we need time to brief you and test the equipment." Sarah stood up from the conference table, her legs unsteady beneath her. "I'll call you by 4 o'clock. "Ms. Chen?" Rodriguez called as Sarah reached the door. "Whatever you decide, please be careful tonight, and please remember that you're not alone in this." But as Sarah left the police station and walked to her car, she felt more alone than she had ever had in her life. The world had revealed itself to be a place where husbands spied on wives, where police asked civilians to risk their lives for evidence, where the choice between safety and justice required calculations she'd never imagined having to make. The recording device in her purse felt heavier now, weighted with the knowledge of what it represented and what it might cost her to use. As she drove back toward her office, Sarah Chen realized that the war begun with a small red light behind a sugar bowl was entering a phase where the casualties would be measured not just in broken trust,
but potentially in blood. The afternoon sun slanted through her windshield like an interrogation lamp, and every shadow looked like it might be hiding surveillance equipment, every reflection potentially concealing eyes that watched and recorded and judged. By 7 o'clock tonight, at Romano's restaurant where they'd shared their first official date 8 years ago, Sarah would have to choose between the woman she'd been and the woman she was becoming. The decision would determine not just the outcome of her marriage, but whether she survived it. Elena Vasquez's law office occupied the top floor of a converted warehouse in the Arts District, its exposed brick walls and floor-to-ceiling windows speaking to someone who valued transparency over traditional legal intimidation. Sarah had called from her car outside the police station, and Maya's contact had agreed to see her immediately, recognizing the urgency in her voice, even through the careful, professional language they'd both learned to use when discussing domestic crisis. Elena herself was in her mid-40s, with silver threading through black hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd spent years looking at evidence that most people preferred to ignore. Her handshake was firm, her office organized but not obsessive, her manner suggesting competence without the performative authority that Sarah had learned to distrust in legal professionals. "Maya told me you're dealing with surveillance in your marriage," Elena said, gesturing toward a comfortable seating area away from her formal desk. But she was light on details. Sarah withdrew the recording device and placed it on the coffee table between them. "I found this in my kitchen this morning. My husband planted it." Elena picked up the device with the careful attention of someone familiar with evidence handling. "Professional grade. Expensive. How long do you think it was there?" "Months, possibly. His behavior started changing about 6 months ago." Sarah described the gradual shift in David's interest patterns, his questions about my work and social life, his suggestions about career moves that would provide access to different types of financial information.
You work in corporate accounting? Partner track at Morrison & Associates. I handle high-profile audits, merger documentation, sensitive financial analysis for major corporations. Elena's expression sharpened. "And your husband is a criminal defense attorney?" "With Morrison Beck and Associates. He specializes in white-collar crime, has extensive connections throughout the legal and law enforcement communities. Tell me about your meeting with Detective Rodriguez." Sarah recounted the police interview, Rodriguez's claims about a corporate espionage ring, the evidence supposedly linking David to surveillance equipment purchases, and the request that she wear a wire to dinner. Elena listened without interruption, taking occasional notes on a legal pad, her expression growing more concerned as Sarah's story unfolded. "Something bothers you about the police contact," Elena observed. "The timing feels too convenient. Rodriguez knew details about David that suggested prior investigation, but she claimed the surveillance reports had only come in within the past week. The evidence she described was too neat, too obvious for someone as smart as David." "Your instincts are probably correct. Criminal defense attorneys don't usually leave paper trails when they're committing crimes." Elena set down her pen and leaned forward slightly. "I think you're dealing with something much more complex than a simple corporate espionage ring." "What do you mean?" "I think your husband is working with law enforcement. I think the surveillance of your home is part of an official investigation, and I think you're being manipulated into providing evidence against yourself or your professional contacts." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Working with law enforcement, official investigation, evidence against herself? The betrayal she'd discovered that morning suddenly revealed new dimensions of deception, layers of manipulation she hadn't even considered. "That's impossible. David would never." "David is a criminal defense attorney who specializes in white-collar crime. He knows how federal investigations work, how evidence is gathered, how targets are developed. If the FBI or another agency suspected corporate espionage involving your firm, they might recruit him to gather intelligence from the inside." Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her again, the solid earth of her assumptions revealing itself to be quicksand. "But the divorce, the surveillance, why would he risk our marriage for a federal investigation?"
Maybe he's not planning to risk it. Maybe he's planning to use it. Alina's voice was gentle but relentless. Think about it. You're married to someone with access to sensitive financial information through one of the city's most prominent accounting firms. You're a potential asset in any investigation involving corporate fraud or illegal merger activity. You're saying he married me for my job? I'm saying he might be using your marriage to further his career. Cooperation with federal investigations is extremely valuable for criminal defense attorneys. It provides access to prosecutors, builds relationships with law enforcement agencies, creates opportunities for favorable treatment of future clients. Sarah's hands were shaking now, the full scope of David's deception beginning to reveal itself like a photograph developing in chemical solution. Not just personal betrayal, but professional manipulation. Not just a husband recording his wife, but a federal asset gathering intelligence on corporate activity through domestic surveillance. The dinner tonight, Sarah said. Romano's. He wants to meet somewhere public, somewhere emotional. He's going to make me an offer. What kind of offer?
Immunity, cooperation, a way out of whatever investigation I'm supposedly part of. Sarah's voice was hollow, mechanical. He's going to present himself as my savior while actually being the architect of my destruction. Elena reached across the coffee table and took Sarah's hands in her own. Listen to me very carefully. Whatever David is planning, whatever he's been told to accomplish, you still have choices. You still have power. What kind of power? The power of knowledge. If David is working with federal investigators, that's not necessarily illegal, but it's ethically problematic. Surveilling your spouse without consent, using marriage as cover for law enforcement operations, those are gray areas that could create serious professional consequences for everyone involved, including the investigators, especially the investigators. Federal agencies are extremely sensitive to any suggestion that they've overstepped constitutional boundaries in domestic surveillance. If you can prove that David was acting on their behalf when he planted that recording device, it could expose civil rights violations that would derail their entire investigation. For the first time since discovering the device that morning, Sarah felt something other than fear or despair. Anger was building in her chest, clean and focused and potentially useful. David had stolen months of her life, violated her privacy, betrayed her trust, and apparently done it all with the blessing of federal law enforcement. But anger without strategy was just noise. Elena was right. Knowledge was power, but only if it could be weaponized effectively. What do I need to do? First, we document everything. Every detail of David's changed behavior, every suspicious conversation, every attempt to manipulate your professional activities. Second, we investigate the investigators. If David is working with federal agencies, there will be records, paperwork, authorization chains that can be traced. And third? Elena's smile was sharp as a blade. Third, we give them exactly what they're asking for, but not in the way they expect. Elena explained her strategy while Sarah listened with the focused attention she brought to complex financial analysis. Instead of wearing the police wire to dinner, Sarah would use her own recording equipment, a high-quality device that Elena provided from her office safe, designed for legal documentation rather than law enforcement entrapment. The difference is control. Their wire is evidence in their investigation, subject to their interpretation and editing. Your recording is evidence in your case, protected by attorney-client privilege and usable however we decide. What if David discovers it? He won't. This equipment is designed to be undetectable, and you'll have the advantage of knowing what he's planning while he assumes you're still operating blind. Elena also provided Sarah with a small GPS tracking device disguised as a jewelry charm. Insurance, she explained. If anything goes wrong, I'll know exactly where you are. You think he'd hurt me? I think desperate people do desperate things, and I think David is about to become very desperate when he realizes you're not the naive victim he's been counting on.
By the time Sarah left Elena's office, the October afternoon had faded into early evening, and the city lights were beginning to flicker on like stars in an artificial constellation. She drove home through familiar streets that no longer felt safe, past houses that might conceal surveillance equipment, past neighbors who might be more than they appeared. The house felt like a crime scene when she entered. Every room potentially contaminated with recording devices, every surface suspect. She moved through their shared space like an investigator, noting details she'd previously overlooked: the electronics David had brought home over the past months, the repositioned furniture that might accommodate better recording angles, the small changes in their environment that she'd attributed to normal household evolution.
Their bedroom felt the most violated. This was where they'd shared their most intimate conversations, where she'd cried about the miscarriage, where she'd expressed fears and doubts and dreams that were never meant for outside ears. If David had recorded their private moments, if federal investigators had access to her grief and vulnerability, Sarah forced herself to shower and change clothes, choosing her outfit for dinner with the same strategic precision she'd once reserved for important client presentations. Professional, but not intimidating, attractive, but not vulnerable, confident, but not confrontational. She was dressing for the most important performance of her life. The recording device Elena had provided was smaller than a pen, designed to clip inside her jacket lapel where it would be invisible but optimally positioned for audio capture. She tested it twice, speaking normally and then in whispers, confirming that it captured both her voice and ambient conversation with crystal clarity. At 6:30, Sarah received a text from Maya. "Mom's at my place. Safe harbor ready whenever you need it. Love you." At 6:35, Detective Rodriguez called. "Have you made your decision about tonight?" "I've decided to handle this my own way." Sarah replied, then hung up before Rodriguez could respond. At 6:45, David texted, "Leaving the office now. See you soon. I love you." The message felt like a taunt, like evidence of how thoroughly he'd manipulated her emotions, even while planning her destruction. But Sarah Chen had spent her career following financial trails wherever they led, uncovering deception that seemed impossible until the numbers revealed their secrets. Tonight, she would apply those same skills to her own life. Romano's restaurant occupied a corner building in the historic district, its warm lighting and intimate atmosphere designed to encourage confession, reconciliation, and the kind of honest conversation that Sarah now knew was impossible between them. She arrived deliberately early, choosing a table with clear sight lines to both entrances, and positioning herself so that the recording device would capture conversation from across the table. David arrived precisely at 7, looking like the successful attorney he'd always appeared to be. Expensive suit, confident posture, the kind of smile that had once made her feel like the luckiest woman in the world. He kissed her cheek before sitting down, a gesture so practiced and empty that she wondered how long he'd been performing their marriage instead of living it. "You look beautiful," he said, settling into his chair and signaling the waiter. "I ordered wine, the Chianti you like." Strategic choice. Alcohol to lower her inhibitions, emotional manipulation through familiar preferences, the illusion of considerate attention, masking careful preparation for whatever conversation he'd actually come here to have. "Thank you." Sarah kept her voice neutral, professional. "You said you had something important to discuss." David's expression shifted slightly, his lawyer instincts apparently detecting something different in her manner. "I do. But first, I want to apologize for this morning, for the recording device. I should have told you what was happening from the beginning." The admission was perfectly crafted, accepting responsibility while implying justified circumstances, expressing regret while suggesting that the surveillance itself wasn't the real problem. "What was happening, David?" "Federal investigation. Corporate espionage ring targeting financial firms in the city. The FBI asked for my cooperation because of my legal background and because," he paused, as if the next words were difficult to say, "because of your position at Morrison and Associates." "My position?" Someone's been stealing merger information, insider trading data, confidential client communications. The leak is coming from inside one of the major accounting firms, possibly yours. The FBI needed a way to monitor communications that wouldn't trigger legal challenges. So they asked you to spy on your wife. David reached across the table and took her hand in his. His fingers were warm, familiar, completely at odds with the calculated manipulation he was describing. I resisted for months, told them to find another way. But when they threatened to get a warrant for our home, to bring you in for questioning, to destroy your career whether you were innocent or guilty, the performance was masterful. David was positioning himself as her protector, the reluctant hero who'd sacrificed their privacy to preserve her freedom. He was making the surveillance sound like love, the betrayal like salvation. You could have told me. I couldn't risk it. The investigation required absolute secrecy. If the real mole knew they were being watched, they'd disappear and take their evidence with them. David's thumb traced across her knuckles, a gesture that had once meant comfort, but now felt like assessment. I hated every minute of it, Sarah. Hated lying to you. Hated watching you like a suspect when I knew you were innocent. Knew I was innocent. Sarah's voice was carefully controlled. But you watched anyway? I protected you. For 6 months, I provided evidence of your innocence while the FBI investigated other potential sources. David's grip on her hand tightened slightly. It's over now. They've identified the real culprit, someone from Hendrickson Associates. You're clear, completely exonerated. Who was it? I can't give you details, but it wasn't anyone you worked with directly. The important thing is that you're safe. We're safe. We can put this behind us and move forward. Sarah studied her husband's face as he delivered his carefully rehearsed explanation. Every word was plausible, every detail designed to make her feel grateful rather than betrayed. If she hadn't spoken with Elena, if she hadn't understood the strategic implications of federal cooperation, she might have believed him. But she'd spent her career detecting financial fraud, recognizing the patterns of deception that looked legitimate, internally consistent, but externally impossible. Federal investigations didn't work the way he was describing. Surveillance authorizations didn't come through criminal defense attorneys. Innocent spouses didn't get protected through secret recording operations. "Show me the authorization," she said. David's expression flickered, just for an instant. What do you mean? The federal authorization for domestic surveillance, the paperwork that gave you permission to record our private conversations. I want to see it. Sarah, that's classified information. I can't. You're a lawyer, David. You know that classification doesn't extend to the targets of surveillance. If I was under investigation, I have the right to see the authorization. If I wasn't under investigation, then the surveillance was illegal. The silence that followed stretched between them like a chasm opening in the earth. Around them, Romano's continued its evening rhythm, couples sharing intimate dinners, families celebrating milestones, the normal human interactions that belonged to a world where trust still existed. David released her hand and sat back in his chair, his expression cycling through calculation, resignation, and something that looked almost like relief. He said, "There is no authorization. There is no federal investigation. There is no corporate espionage ring." The confession hit the table like a physical object, solid and undeniable and terrifying in its implications. Sarah felt her chest tighten, her breathing become shallow, her vision narrow to the space between them where 8 years of marriage was dissolving into something unrecognizable. "Then why?" she whispered. David signaled the waiter and ordered a double scotch before answering. When he spoke, his voice carried a weariness that seemed to come from someplace deep and dark and long hidden. "Because I needed evidence for the divorce proceedings. Because I needed proof that you were unfit, unstable, a risk to any future custody arrangements." He met her eyes directly for the first time that evening. "Because I've been planning to leave you for over a year, and I needed documentation that would ensure you got nothing." The words hung in the restaurant air like smoke from a fire that had been burning underground for months, finally breaking through to the surface where its destruction could be seen and measured. Sarah stared at David across the table where they'd celebrated anniversaries and birthdays and promotions, where they'd planned their future and shared their dreams, where she'd believed they were building something together instead of documenting its careful demolition. "Custody arrangements," she repeated slowly. "We don't have children." David's scotch arrived, and he took a long sip before responding. His face had changed since the confession, the practiced warmth replaced by something colder and more calculating. It was like watching a mask being removed to reveal a stranger underneath. "Claire is pregnant." The second revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making the restaurant lights blur at the edges. Claire! David was having an affair, had gotten his mistress pregnant, had been planning their divorce while simultaneously building a legal case to destroy her. How long? Sarah's voice sounded distant even to herself. 8 months. We've been together for almost a year. David's tone was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing a business transaction rather than the systematic destruction of their marriage. "Claire works in family law. She helped me understand what kind of evidence I'd need to ensure a favorable settlement." 8 months. David had been sleeping with another woman, planning a family with her, building a case against his wife, all while maintaining the illusion of their marriage with such skill that Sarah had never suspected. The level of deception required was staggering, the emotional compartmentalization almost sociopathic. The recording devices. "You were trying to prove I was unstable. I was documenting patterns of behavior that could be interpreted as emotional instability. Your conversations with Maya about your frustrations with our marriage, your complaints about my work schedule, your concerns about starting a family after the miscarriage. Taken out of context, compiled over months, it creates a picture of someone who's struggling with mental health issues." Taken out of context. Sarah's hands were shaking now, but her voice remained steady. "You were planning to use my grief about losing our baby as evidence that I was unfit. I was planning to protect my future family. Claire and I want children, multiple children. I couldn't risk having you complicate that future through spite or emotional manipulation." The casual cruelty of his words was breathtaking. David was talking about their miscarriage, the most devastating experience of Sarah's life, as if it were evidence of character deficiency rather than profound loss. He was reducing her grief to strategy, her pain to legal ammunition. "You held my hand in the hospital when we lost the baby. You cried with me. I felt genuinely sad about the miscarriage, but I also realized it was an opportunity to document your emotional instability during a difficult period." David finished his scotch and signaled for another. His face had changed since the confession, the practiced warmth replaced by something colder and more calculating. It was like watching a mask being removed to reveal a stranger underneath. The recording devices. "You were trying to prove I was unstable. I was documenting patterns of behavior that could be interpreted as emotional instability. Your conversations with Maya about your frustrations with our marriage, your complaints about my work schedule, your concerns about starting a family after the miscarriage. Taken out of context, compiled over months, it creates a picture of someone who's struggling with mental health issues. Taken out of context, you were planning to use my grief about losing our baby as evidence that I was unfit.
Claire thought it would be beneficial if you had access to merger documentation that could be challenged in court, financial irregularities that could suggest professional incompetence or ethical violations. David's second scotch arrived and he took an immediate sip. We needed leverage beyond just the surveillance recordings. Sarah felt a strange sense of detachment settling over her, as if she were observing this conversation from outside her own body. The woman sitting across from David seemed like someone she'd once known but could no longer reach, someone naive enough to believe in partnership and trust and shared futures. How much of our marriage was real? David considered the question with the careful attention he might give to a complex legal brief. The first 5 years were genuine. I loved you, wanted to build a life with you, saw our relationship as permanent. He paused, swirling his scotch in its glass. But love isn't always enough. You're ambitious but not ruthless, successful but not strategic. You have integrity, which is admirable, but ultimately limiting. Limiting how? You'd never compromise your principles for advancement, never bend rules for profit, never prioritize success over ethics. David's tone suggested he was describing character flaws rather than strengths. Claire understands that success requires flexibility. She's willing to do whatever it takes to build the kind of life we want. Including helping you destroy your current wife? Including helping me transition from a relationship that was stagnating to one with genuine potential for growth. The language was perfect lawyer speak, sanitized and euphemistic, making betrayal sound like business development. Sarah recognized the technique from white-collar fraud cases, the way white-collar criminals used professional vocabulary to distance themselves from the human consequences of their actions. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we proceed with an amicable divorce. I've already filed the papers. They'll be served tomorrow morning. No fault dissolution, equitable distribution of assets, clean separation that protects both our professional reputations." David's voice took on a sales pitch quality. "You keep the house, half our savings, your full pension and retirement accounts. I keep my practice, my client base, my future earning potential. And if I refuse, if I fight the terms?" David's expression hardened. "Then the recordings become evidence of your emotional instability. Your conversations with Maya about your marriage troubles, your complaints about my work schedule, your concerns about having children. All of it gets presented as proof that you're struggling with mental health issues that make you unfit for normal professional and personal responsibilities. You'd destroy my career? I'd protect mine, and Claire's, and our children's." David finished his second scotch and checked his watch. "I'm sorry it's come to this, Sarah. I genuinely hoped you'd accept the settlement without complications. I haven't agreed to anything." "You will, because fighting me means destroying yourself, and you're too smart for self-destructive choices." David stood up from the table, his movements smooth and practiced. "Claire's waiting for me at home. Our home. The house where we're going to raise our family." He dropped a $100 bill on the table, enough to cover their wine and his scotch with a generous tip that suggested a man comfortable with his financial position. Then he leaned down and kissed Sarah's forehead, a gesture so familiar and empty that it felt like being touched by a ghost. David straightened his tie, a small gesture that somehow contained all his arrogance and control. "This doesn't have to be ugly, Sarah. We can end this with dignity." Then he walked away, leaving Sarah alone at their table with the wreckage of 8 years of marriage and the certain knowledge that the war begun with a small red light behind a sugar bowl was far from over. Sarah sat in Romano's for another 20 minutes, nursing the wine David had ordered and letting the full scope of his betrayal settle into her consciousness like sediment in still water. Around her, other couples continued their dinners, their conversations, their normal lives that hadn't been systematically dismantled by the people they trusted most. But as the initial shock began to fade, something else took its place. Anger, yes, but also clarity. David had made a fatal mistake in his carefully orchestrated confession. He'd revealed not just his strategy, but his vulnerability. Not just his plans, but his assumptions about her character and capabilities. Sarah Chen had built her career on following financial trails wherever they led, no matter how complex or uncomfortable the destination.
She'd exposed fraud that had been hidden by teams of experts, uncovered deception that had fooled federal auditors, traced money through networks designed to hide their true purposes. David thought he understood her limitations, but he was about to learn that integrity wasn't weakness, that ethics weren't obstacles, and that a woman with nothing left to lose could be far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. She left Romano's and drove directly to Elena's office, where the lawyer was waiting with a pot of coffee and the kind of focused intensity that suggested she'd been planning for this moment since their afternoon meeting. "How did it go?" Elena asked, as Sarah settled into the chair across from her desk. Sarah removed the recording device from her jacket and placed it on Elena's desk. He confessed to everything: adultery, conspiracy to commit fraud, domestic surveillance without consent, planning to use fabricated evidence in divorce proceedings. Her voice was steady, but her hands were still shaking slightly. His mistress is pregnant. They've been planning this for over a year. Elena connected the recording device to her computer and began transferring the audio files. "Did he threaten you directly?" "He threatened to destroy my career if I don't accept his divorce terms, threatened to use recordings of my private conversations as evidence of mental instability." Sarah accepted a cup of coffee and wrapped her hands around its warmth. "He thinks he holds all the cards." "He's about to learn otherwise." Elena's smile was sharp with satisfaction. What he just did, confessing to domestic surveillance, threatening to use illegally obtained recordings in court proceedings, conspiracy to commit fraud through fabricated evidence, that's not just grounds for divorce, that's grounds for criminal prosecution. Can we prove it? We just did. His confession is complete, recorded with his knowledge that you were documenting the conversation, admissible in both criminal and civil proceedings. Domestic surveillance without consent is a felony in this state. Using illegally obtained recordings in court proceedings is prosecutorial misconduct, even when done by private attorneys. Conspiracy to commit fraud through fabricated evidence is a federal crime. What about the pregnancy, his relationship with Claire? Adultery isn't a crime, but using an affair partner to build a legal case against a spouse crosses into conspiracy territory. If Claire provided professional legal advice to help David defraud you, she could lose her law license and face criminal charges. Sarah felt something loosening in her chest, a tension she'd been carrying since discovering the recording device that morning. For the first time in 12 hours, she wasn't fighting alone against an opponent with superior resources and connections. What's our next move? Elena was already drafting documents on her computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. First, we file for emergency injunctive relief to prevent David from disposing of any assets or accessing your joint accounts. Second, we submit the recording to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation. Third, we file a civil suit for damages related to the surveillance and attempted fraud. How long will this take?
The emergency motions can be filed tonight. Criminal charges could come within days if the DA's office moves quickly. Civil proceedings will take longer, but David's confession makes the outcome fairly certain. Elena paused in her typing and looked directly at Sarah. "I need you to understand something. This is going to get ugly. David and Claire will fight back, probably with allegations against you, attempts to discredit your testimony, claims that you somehow entrapped him into confessing. Let them try." Sarah's voice carried a steel that surprised even her. "I've spent my career exposing fraud, following evidence wherever it leads. David made the mistake of thinking that integrity was weakness. He's about to learn the difference between being ethical and being naive." Elena grinned. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." They worked until nearly midnight, drafting motions and organizing evidence, building a case that would dismantle David's strategy before he realized what was happening. Sarah provided detailed documentation of David's changed behavior over the past months, financial records showing his purchases of surveillance equipment, and testimony about his attempts to manipulate her career decisions. "One more thing," Elena said as they prepared to leave. "Do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight? Somewhere David won't think to look for you?"
My sister's place. She's expecting me. Good. Don't go home. Don't retrieve any personal items. Don't contact David for any reason. As of right now, you're a protected witness in a criminal investigation. Sarah drove to Maya's apartment through empty streets that felt different now, cleaner somehow, as if David's confession had lifted a weight from the entire city. The recording device in her purse no longer felt like evidence of betrayal, but like proof of justice. Documentation that would restore balance to a world that had been tilted toward deception for too long. Maya was waiting with hot chocolate and the kind of fierce protectiveness that only sisters could provide. Her mother had already gone to bed, but she'd left a note on the kitchen counter. Whatever's happening, we'll face it together. That's what families do. How bad was it? Maya asked as they settled onto her couch. Worse than I imagined, but also more complete than I'd hoped. Sarah described the dinner conversation, David's systematic confession, Elena's legal strategy for turning his admissions into criminal charges. He thought he was explaining why I should accept his terms. Instead, he was building the case for his own prosecution. What happens to Claire? Professional misconduct charges, possible criminal conspiracy, definitely disbarment proceedings. Turns out using legal knowledge to help someone destroy their marriage is frowned upon by the State Bar Association. Maya was quiet for a moment, processing the scope of David's betrayal and its consequences. Are you okay? Really okay? Sarah considered the question seriously. Was she okay? Her marriage was over, her trust was shattered, her sense of reality had been fundamentally altered. But something else was emerging from the wreckage. A sense of her own strength, her own capability, her own power to fight back against injustice. I'm better than okay, she said finally. I'm free. 3 months later, the criminal trial of David Chen and Claire Morrison dominated local legal news for weeks, a cautionary tale about the intersection of personal ambition and professional ethics. Both defendants were convicted on multiple felony counts, David for domestic surveillance, conspiracy to commit fraud, and attempted destruction of evidence, Claire for conspiracy, professional misconduct, and abuse of her position as a family law attorney. David received 3 years in federal prison and permanent disbarment. Claire received 2 years and loss of her law license. Both faced civil judgments that would follow them for decades, financial consequences that ensured their carefully planned future would never materialize.
Sarah's divorce was finalized 6 weeks after David's conviction, with a settlement that awarded her their house, David's share of their joint assets, and significant additional damages for the surveillance and emotional distress. She donated a portion of the settlement to organizations supporting domestic abuse survivors, recognizing that her experience, while unique in its specific details, was part of a larger pattern of intimate partner surveillance and control. 6 months later, Elena Vasquez stood before the State Bar Association's Continuing Education Conference, addressing a packed auditorium of family law attorneys about the Chen case and its implications for domestic relations practice. The case of Chen versus Chen established important precedents regarding electronic surveillance in domestic settings, Elena explained to her audience. But more importantly, it demonstrated that intimate partner surveillance is not just a privacy violation, but a form of domestic abuse that can escalate into criminal behavior. In the audience, Sarah Chen listened to Elena's presentation with the satisfaction of someone who'd helped create legal precedent that would protect future victims. She'd returned to Morrison & Associates after taking a brief leave of absence, but her role had evolved beyond corporate accounting to include forensic analysis of domestic surveillance cases. Her expertise in following complex financial trails had proven invaluable in exposing the networks of surveillance equipment suppliers, data storage services, and legal consultants who enabled intimate partner spying. She'd helped law enforcement trace surveillance equipment purchases, identify patterns of domestic surveillance, and build cases against both individual perpetrators and the businesses that profited from intimate partner abuse. 1 year later,
The house on Maple Street felt different now, transformed from a surveillance site into a sanctuary. Sarah had kept the property but renovated extensively, removing every piece of technology that David had installed and redesigning the space to reflect her own aesthetic rather than their shared history. The kitchen, where she discovered the first recording device, now featured an open breakfast bar where she hosted monthly meetings of a support group for surveillance survivors. The living room that had been wired for sound now contained comfortable seating for women learning to rebuild their lives after discovering that their homes had been turned into evidence-gathering operations. Sarah Chen's life shattered the morning she found a recording device hidden behind her sugar bowl. What began as a shocking discovery of her husband David's surveillance operation evolved into a 15-year crusade that would reshape domestic violence law across America. David, a successful attorney, had secretly monitored Sarah for months, recording her conversations and tracking her movements through hidden cameras and GPS devices throughout their home. But Sarah, a forensic accountant with a keen eye for detail, didn't just escape. She fought back strategically, documenting evidence and building a case that would expose an entire network of intimate partner surveillance. With the help of attorney Elena Vasquez, social worker Maya, and her resilient mother Margaret, Sarah transformed from victim to survivor to national advocate. Her legal victory in Chen versus Chen established groundbreaking precedents, while her testimony before the Supreme Court helped pass federal legislation criminalizing intimate partner surveillance. The story spans 15 years, following Sarah's journey from that devastating kitchen discovery to testifying before the Supreme Court. She founded support groups that grew into an international network, consulted on hundreds of similar cases, and helped create corporate accountability standards for surveillance equipment manufacturers. What makes this story remarkable isn't just Sarah's personal triumph over betrayal, but how she channeled her trauma into protecting thousands of other women. The recording device that once represented violation became a symbol of the power of evidence and the courage to fight back against systematic abuse. Sarah's war began with a small red light behind a sugar bowl and became a global movement, ensuring that intimate partner surveillance is recognized as the serious crime it truly is, proving that one woman's refusal to remain silent can indeed change the world. Subscribe to hear more stories where silence is never forgotten and justice always finds a way.